Hey everyone, welcome to the Student Ministry Conversations podcast with your hosts, Russell Martin and Brent Aiken. We are glad that you're joining us today, and we hope that you find this conversation helpful, insightful, and encouraging as you lead your students in ministry. We want to remind you about our social media. You can find us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Talk Student Men, as well as our website, studentministryconversations.org. Now today we're going to hear a conversation that Russell had, with me. We take a break from our normal reaching out to guests to interview each other for the podcast as well. And you'll get to hear Russell's conversation that he has interviewing me. And then as we get a little closer to our 1-year anniversary of the podcast, Russell will be interviewed at that time. And so, Russell, this is technically your conversation, and I am your guest. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the conversation?
Yes. Well, we talk about leadership with students and not necessarily the process or the program that you set up for student ministry leadership. We have several other episodes that talk about that, but we're talking about how do you find those students who you see those leadership skills in, and how do you then equip them and encourage them for leadership. And so it's a great conversation. I look forward to everyone hearing it.
Awesome. Let's get into this conversation with me and Russell.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Student Ministry Conversations podcast. I am Russell Martin. I am one of your hosts. And it turns out today that our other host is on the other side of the microphone. Brent is here. And so this is our first ever interviewing of each other. We don't know why we haven't done this before, but we're going to do another episode probably next month where Brent's going to interview me. But today we're kind of turning the mic on Brent and interviewing him. And so, Brent, I know that you have been on this podcast for almost a year now, and people know some about you. But I don't know if we've ever heard your story of how you got into ministry or how you got to where you are today. So you can give us that real short or that real long introduction, and just kind of tell us who you are and let us get to know Brent Aiken.
Yeah, just for a moderately concise bio, I have been around Central Texas all of my life, and I've been in and a part of church as long as I can remember. Fun fact, I actually work at the church that I grew up in, and I think that I think one of the things that helps me is I only went to this church until I was in 5th grade, and then we moved and I did high school and junior high somewhere else. So it's not my youth group, but I did go to this church when I was a little kid. And so with that, I had a fantastic youth pastor by the name of Blake Durham. He's still one of my best friends. And we don't connect as much as I'd like to, but we're both busy family guys, both in ministry still, and schedule sometimes conflicts. And so, but with that, Blake was really that first person that poured into my life from a ministry standpoint. He really, really took the time to show that not only did I have worth in Christ, but I could potentially have a future in ministry. And so between in my junior high church camp years, I accepted a call into ministry, and I had no idea what that meant, but I knew God wanted me to do it. And so I said yes, and then it kind of got quiet for a little bit. I, of course, said yes at camp when you're on the church camp high, and for a couple of years, it was just like, oh, well, I mean, yeah, I guess I did do that. And then the end of my sophomore year of high school, my youth pastor, Blake, left. And he moved to another church. And so they put together a youth pastor search committee and all this fun stuff. And needless to say, that search took over a year. And so during that search process, me and a buddy took over our youth program, and we taught most of the lessons. We organized all the trips and the events and everything like that. And so that was kind of my first getting my feet wet in student ministry, was actually leading my own student ministry, which was really, really cool. And then I went off into college, got involved in a college ministry, and really kind of felt a shift for a little bit of like, maybe God wants me to do college. And I'll never forget, I was at a conference for that college ministry. and like someone just randomly came up to me, and it's one of the trippiest God moments I've ever had in my life. But someone came up to me in the middle of like the worship area that we were worshiping at, because we were in a hotel, so it was one of the lobbies of the hotel, and they just tapped me on my shoulder and they were like, "Hey, I don't know who you are. I have no idea why I'm telling you this, but God said stick true to what He told you to do." And it was like, oh, okay, so maybe not college ministry. And so probably about 6 months ish, 8 months later, I married my wife. And that was my sophomore year, end of my sophomore year of college. About a month before that, my youth pastor, Blake, contacted me and said, "Hey, I know you want to be in youth ministry. I just saw that the church that I started at is looking for a youth pastor. It's a fantastic church. They are great at getting, helping new youth pastors kind of hit the ground running. And they're really, really just an awesome church to work for." And so I applied. I didn't get the job. I was the second choice, but by God's grace, the first guy that they chose lived in Louisiana, and he could not get his schedule and like travel arrangements and everything to actually move for the job. And so I was their choice as number two. I always include that because it's like, there were so many different steps that like God was like, no, like here. So super cool. But for now, I am in my 12th year, I think 13th year, something like that, of student ministry. I've served at 3 different churches. This is my longest stint at a church right now, and I close 5 years in May. And yeah, man, I do this. I am happily married. It'll be 12 years in May as well. Actually, I guess so. It's closing my 12th year. That would make sense if I did youth ministry. I started, and then yeah. So closing my 12th year of ministry. And then I'm also finishing up my 12th year of marriage in May. My wife is amazing. Love her to death. We have 2 biological children and 1 foster daughter. And they keep us busy. But other than that, man, I love where I'm at. I love my church. I love the town that I live in. I love doing this podcast. Honestly, this has been one of the most encouraging and life-giving things I've done personally in a really, really long time. And so like, I genuinely look forward to the conversations that I do get to do. And like, I always come off, I'm sure my associate youth pastor now like hates that I do this podcast, because every time I listen to somebody or like I interview somebody, I'm like, "Hey, so we need to reevaluate this." And she's like, okay, all right. And so she just like happily plays along, but I'm sure she's tired of it, because I mean, there's been so many different radical things that I've learned through this podcast that I'm just like, all right, we're doing this. Like we could be doing this better. We need to work on this. So, yeah. But
and that's kind of the reason we started the podcast, is to bring those conversations to people. And so today we're talking to you and bringing your conversation. And so I like that you started off in your story talking about how your youth pastor kind of poured into you, and then how he equipped you to take that to be in leadership, and then the opportunity came and you stepped into that. And so that's kind of what we're talking about today is how do we equip and encourage and empower? Brent knows that's kind of one of my catchphrases that I always like to use. How do we equip and encourage and empower students for ministry? And then also, give them those opportunities and see the leadership. How do we see that leadership potential in students and develop that and push them to be and empower them to be those leaders. So I just want to start off and we kind of talked about this topic that we were going to talk about this today. So before I jump into any of my questions, I just want to kind of give you the opening kind of just thought of what are your thoughts just in general, and we'll dive down a little bit as far as student ministry. Why was this something that you wanted to talk about with your one interview of a podcast host? Why did you want to talk about this?
Well, it's kind of interesting. so like ironically, like I think this is something that I've really, really grown to love, as far as like actually doing this, over the past couple of years. But, if you've ever done, any studies on the Enneagram, I am an Enneagram 8, which means I shoot and then I aim and then I actually load the gun. And so like my action center is always like go with the gut, like whatever, stuff like that. And so that also leads to some terrible tendencies of me thinking I don't do anything great. And so I really struggled with like coming up with the topic on this. And so I actually just went and I was like, what's the best way I can do this if I really don't think I do anything? I was like, well, I'm going to ask other people. And so I went and asked other people. And they were like, well, hey, here's a couple things you do. And I am actually taking this from my associate youth pastor. And she was like, I think hands down, the thing that you do the best is like you push students past their comfort zones to make them lead better. And I was like, okay, yeah, I could talk about that. And so with that, that's how the conversation came to be. And I really think it's something, like I said, over the past 3 years or so that I've really, really kind of honed in on and like really tried to start working on harnessing like what that is, with the goal of, I've always seen youth ministry as like our job's not done when they leave. I want to equip them and encourage them for long after they leave the student ministry. And part of that is leadership. They have to know how to lead in a lot of different scenarios and environments. And it doesn't even have to be necessarily just church. Leadership qualities in students are significantly important, but I think a lot of that can be learned through a Christian lens.
Yeah. And we've had conversations on this before. I know Brandon Hare had a conversation talking about leadership, and Daniel Acton, and I encourage y'all to go back and listen to those because they have some great stuff. But I think we kind of touched on some processes and some structures, and I think today we'll probably do some of those, but we'll also kind of get into some of that background, like what are you thinking as a leader? How do you before you set up that process or before you get that student in there, how do you find those and do that? So the first question I want to ask you is, how do you know students are ready to lead? So we're all called to ministry, especially in our denomination. We talk about the ministry of everybody. We all have a call, and I think this is pretty general to many different denominations. But how do you, when you're looking out and you see those students and you're like, yeah, they're not ready. Wait, that one right there. What are those characteristics that you see in students that kind of just perk your ears up or catch your eye that make you think, hey, I need to pay a little more attention and maybe start focusing in on that student?
Yeah, I would say that there's a few, and I'll try and be as practical as I can with them. And granted, it's not necessarily like a tried and true method that works every single time. But I will say that I've noticed some definite qualities and characteristics of stuff, where like it's just like, hey, I noticed that. Like that was a really big move. I don't think they noticed that yet. And some of them can be just as small as, the ones that are more comfortable with leading will be the ones that'll actually volunteer to pray. And like that sounds like a really, really small, meaningless task. But like in the grand scheme of things, as a teenager, you are stepping up with your voice over all of your peers, leading the group in prayer. That is a huge, huge deal. And so a lot of times I tell my students, like, I'll say, all right, who wants to pray? Close us out, kind of thing like that. And like, if it gets quiet, I'll be like, all right, someone needs to volunteer before I volunteer. And so I'll just randomly call out students and just be like, all right, nope, you're praying and stuff like that. And that's the other side of it, is like some of them will be like, no. And like they'll get super defensive and they'll like kind of rear up and like put up a wall and stuff like that. And I'm like, all right, I maybe not what I'm thinking. And then there's others that are like, oh, okay. And like, just do it. And so like having that, I guess, gumption, gusto, whatever you want to call it, to be able to step up when asked or when called upon. And then the other thing I would say is leadership goes in phases. And so obviously I'm not going to be like, hey, I really noticed this first step of leadership in you. Like, you're going to teach next week. Like, no one's going to do that. But giving them opportunities to step up, getting them comfortable with stepping into that position of, hey, I'm leading this, is fantastic. And some of that can be whether it's like leading audio and visuals or being on the worship team or whatever. But I try to do a little more intentional focus to where they're actually like leading their students in something. And then the other thing, one of the other big telltale signs that I notice is selfless moments. Selfless moments are a big thing of leadership in my mind, because the greatest leaders are selfless. And so I have randomly had students in the past that'll come up to me and say, hey, I noticed that someone's really like so-and-so is going through this really hard time. And I talked to them at school about it. And they said that their parents are thinking about divorce. And so we need to be praying for them. And like, it's just one of those things that it's like, oh, all right. Like, yeah, we'll pray for them, but like, you're on my radar now. Like, I'm watching you because like, you just showed that A, you're putting others in front of yourself, and B, you were confident enough in that being a problem that you came and directly addressed it to me, which was a pretty big deal. And so those are two really big practical ones. The other thing that I usually try to gauge on is their ability to include the group. Especially when they get into high school, you tend to have two different sides of high schoolers. You have high schoolers that are really inclusive of the junior high, and high schoolers that aren't at all. And so the high schoolers that really kind of tend to open up and hang out and goof off with the junior high are the ones that I also want to be up there, because they don't care that the junior high are crazy, or they aren't cool, or they don't care about what other people are going to think. If they're out there playing dodgeball with a bunch of 6th and 7th graders and they're like a junior in high school, I see that as an awesome moment, because they are equipping the younger kids, whether they know it or not. They're giving them a role model. They're giving them opportunities to grow and opportunities to see someone that is a healthy leader that's just a few years older than them. So I think all three of those are super important. And man, I mean, those there's probably more, but those are probably my big three. Just actually taking the step when you're asked to, of like, whether it be prayer or anything like that. And then selfless thoughts. And then the high schoolers being able to step down and like kind of almost lay down their pride in a sense, because a lot of high schoolers, like, hanging out with junior high is a pride issue. It's like, I'm past that stage. And the thing I always say to them is like, hey, look, you were their age. Mm-hmm. What did you want more than anything else in junior high? You wanted to hang out with the high schoolers because you thought they were cool. I said, so now you have a chance to be that cool high schooler. And so a lot of them, there's some that take that and run with it, and there's some that don't. But those three tendencies, you can really tell as like a basis on that. And then I loved how you said the whole engage, equip, encourage. I actually used that in a previous youth group. I don't use it now. Yeah. We called it E3, and that was like the premise of our student discipleship process. But yeah, great stuff.
Yeah. And that engage, it's like the beginning, the equipping them, and then encouraging them to take leadership. And there are all sorts of different models and things that people have for that. I agree. Those three steps are things that I saw when I was doing in student ministry, and I look for not in student ministry. Like you said, it's not just leadership for a youth group, but I am now a senior pastor at a church. And those are the same things I still look for, whether it is students who have those or whether it's adults, the same thing. So those are universal, whether you're doing youth or college or even kids and such. And I remember a lot of the times, the students who became my strongest leaders were the ones who I saw cleaning up, wiping the tables down after stuff, or volunteering to set stuff up, or saying, hey, come with me. So those are great. So
yeah, without a doubt.
As you see that potential, though, what is your next step? Like, how do you say, hey, I see this? And I'm sure, like we said with the first question, there's probably 1,000 different ways, but what are the ways that you find yourself either talking to that student or beginning to that process of equipping? What does that look like?
Yeah, I'd say so. The biggest part with like finding that, I mean, I would say that even like before that, like the whole engagement process, like a lot of my engagement process happens after I've seen those initial indicators of like, hey, this kid's got it. Man, I just start speaking life into them. Like, gosh, I can't wait till XYZ so you can be a leader at this. Like I see that, man, like you're gonna be such an awesome music leader, like worship leader. Like I can't wait for you to be on the worship team because of your skill set, because of your like attitude when you're here, when you're at school. Like you were such a leader. And so like just speaking that life into them gives them the opportunity to be like, oh, I can do that. Like, really? Okay. I'm a leader. Yeah. And so like you see their dynamics change as you start speaking life into them. As far as equipping, we actually do a so let me preface with the fact that we hold leadership to high school only. And so a lot of times I use junior high as that, like, that's where I start noticing leadership characteristics and qualities. And then there's occasionally high schoolers that I'll be like, hey, no, I didn't see you, but I would really like you to be involved. And so I really start encouraging them in junior high. And that junior high, the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade gives me a couple years to really, really speak life into what I see in them and like how dynamic of a leader I think they'll be. And then also like occasionally I'll see more than that. I'm not going to say I have like a spiritual gift of prophecy or anything like that, but I do think that there's moments that I'm like, hey, I really see you step into ministry. Like, I don't know if it's youth ministry or children's ministry, but you have a tremendous heart for kids. And like, you just start, like I said, start speaking that life into them to where if they hear it enough, they'll start believing it. I mean, we always talk about the culture around us that is so like negative and downplaying and derogative and everything like that, and how kids start to believe that. Well, we can do the opposite of that too. And so when we speak life and speak encouragement and speak positivity in kids' lives, it will change them for the better. And I'm a big advocate on that of like, hey, like I see this in you. And I don't know if you see it yet, but like this is going to be a tremendous asset that you have. And it allows them to kind of hear it and they start chewing on it. And they kind of start doing this like identity evaluation of like, is that really me? Am I doing this? And 9 times out of 10, and I have had some where this is not necessarily a failure, but I've tried to put them in leadership positions and they're like, no way, dude. Like they try it and they're like, no, not me. I can't do it. And so it does fail on occasion, but like what in life do you do perfectly? So there will be kids that kind of back out and say, hey, but they're not necessarily backing out of leadership. They just aren't doing what you thought they would do. Mm-hmm. So there's still opportunities to find leadership for them in other ways. But yeah, I would say speak life into them. And as far as equipping, like I said, we do high school only for our leadership. We do a high school leadership group once a week on Sundays. And it's not super heavily attended, but we do very, very much intentionally try to strive for leadership building qualities. We use leader treks once a week or once a month, excuse me. Leader treks once a month. And if you're a Download Youth Ministry subscriber, you get the student leadership leader treks once a month in your free downloads. And so we literally just use those and their curriculum is super good. And occasionally we'll tweak things, but most of the time it's just like, hey, we'll read through it and like, man, this is good. This is great. And we'll just go with it. The other things that we try to do is we just try to incorporate real world leadership. And then also like team building, we try to incorporate. One of the things that we're working on right now that we're going to spend a few weeks on outside of that once a month leader treks training is we're teaching them and we're working on them being the start of our push for all of our students to have testimonies. And so we are challenging them and encouraging them to be the ones that step up and give their 3-minute testimony. And then we're actually going to record most of our leaders giving their testimonies so we can start playing them in our services. And then when we have them recorded for our services, then we can kind of make that a push to the generalized rest of the youth group. And we can say, hey, like these students have stepped up first. These students have their testimonies. And like, not only are they willing to talk to you more about their testimonies, but now it's your turn. Like you've seen these kids step up. Here's the opportunity. So that's what we're working on right now. So it's just real life practice for leadership scenarios. We try to do as random as possible. Some days we're at the church. We've met at grocery stores before, to where like legitimately we just go in and I did an old challenge that we do with like it's normally accustomed to like 30-hour famine and stuff like that, but like where you have to go feed a family for $5 or something like that. And we just like, leadership example, like just because you see a person's outside, you have no idea what their history is. You have no idea what their internal circumstances, external circumstances are. And so you can't judge a book by its cover. And so we talked about like the importance of like treating everybody equally and like having respect for even the lowest and like all this stuff. And I mean, those are just real life practical leadership examples, but we normally try and throw a little gospel twist in there as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you have a whole lot there, but I want to go back to something you said about in the beginning of that answer, which was speaking of possibility in students, like seeing, because I mean, you are where you are because your youth leader said, hey, you would be good at this, or, and I know that I'm where I am because way back in the day, I helped with the lock-in. I was the young college student who came home and they're like, hey, we're doing a youth lock-in. You should help. And I was like, sure, that sounds great. And because I was just the young guy and they needed somebody else there. And after I did that one summer, the next summer I was saying I was looking for a job and someone said, you did really well the lock-in. You should look into student ministry. And it was nobody who I mean, yours was like a youth director, but mine was just somebody at the church who was like, hey, I saw this and noticed it. And I just wanted to tell you that. And so I think that is huge to see those possibilities in students because they might not live into it at first. Like it may take a while, but it's going to stick with them. It's going to stick with them as they go through. So one of the things when you talked about your time with your leadership team was it seems like you spent a lot of time with your leadership team and your students and stuff like that, especially extra time. What is the importance of, I mean, you probably have, I don't know how many kids you have in your group, but you have a bunch of other students in your group. Yeah. So how do you justify spending more time with them and how does that work out with your group? Is there any problems or issues or?
So it doesn't necessarily, well, I'll say twofold. My approach on this is greatly changed from my last church to this church, partially because I have an associate youth pastor, which allows me to kind of I still hang out with all the kids. Don't get me wrong. We have a group of if ever, we always say like, we have a group of this, but like if everybody showed up on the same Wednesday, we'd have probably 65, 70 kids. We normally are in the ballpark range of 40, 45. And so with that, we have a lot of different opportunities for kids to be engaged, but then that's something that we also kind of push our parents to do as well. It's something we really try to, our not our parents, our leaders, but we push our leaders to build those relationships. We push the kids to make those relationships. And so while I do hang out with all of them and I'm still involved, and we typically try to schedule leadership events away from the rest of the group, I would say that I do shift towards like hanging out with the high school primarily because that's my group. I'm in charge of the high school. And I let my associate kind of handle the junior high, but I still am involved enough to where if they've been here more than once or twice, I know their names, I know what school they're at, I know all that stuff. And so we're not quite large enough to where it's past that point. But like, I'd still try to be involved in everything. And we just schedule leadership off the cuff, like outside of our normal activities.
Yeah. Well, I think that's important for youth leaders to know, especially if they're kind of like, maybe right now they have 15 kids or 10, but they're going to grow. We're coming out of pandemic stuff. People are starting to come back to things. And as your groups grow, I mean, that was a hard thing for me to realize that at one point I was a minister to the students. And it was a period of like 3 or 4 months where I switched and I was the minister to the leaders, the adult and the student leaders. And they were the ministers to the students. And there's a grieving process with that too. So if you go through that, know that there's a point where you realize, hey, I can't just throw everybody in a van and go somewhere. I don't know everybody. I don't get to talk to everybody every night. Yeah. But I'm equipping those who do. And that's biblical. That's Jesus and the disciples. That's Moses and Jethro and dividing people up. I mean, there's basis for that. That's the apostles saying we can't take care of everybody. We can't take care of everybody. So we're going to divide the responsibility. And you are living into your call as a leader doing that because you are equipping and encouraging others to be in ministry and giving them the opportunity, even if it means that you're not right there with everybody all the time. So anything else we talked about seeing potential. We talked about challenging. So anything else on challenging them that you would add?
The only thing I would say is like, especially with challenging, like you have to kind of warm them up too. And so you start with smaller tasks. And like one of the things that's really cool right now is actually I'm in a season in our high school ministry to where I have not taught in a month. And I am not going to teach. Today is March 8th, by the way, because this episode's going to come out in like 2 days or something. I will not teach again, probably this entire semester. And part of that is I've challenged the high school students to step up and lead. And so legitimately we have like 12 high schoolers that literally are going week by week and took over this entire semester. And so I've completely shifted my gaze for this semester from like teaching lessons and like working to like be the lesson giver to like helping high schoolers learn how to prep lessons and how to come up with content and how to find scripture and how to pray into your message and how to practice and everything like that. So they can be ready to deliver messages each week for this entire semester. I'm pumped. It's so awesome seeing the kids kind of step into that. And this even kind of transcends outside of leadership. We have a couple high school that aren't leadership that are doing it, but the leaders, man, like I had one that was supposed to, he was supposed to speak 2 weeks ago. And we had a like freeze. And so we canceled Wednesday night. And so I was like, hey, sorry. I was like, didn't mean for that to happen. I was like, would you rather me like, throw you at the very back of the list to where like you close out our student speaking semester, or do you just want me to use you as like a fill-in if like someone drops? And he goes, I don't care. Like, whatever. Like, he's like, I'm ready. I mean, it doesn't bother me. And so it's cool to see the kids like really, really buying into the fact of like, yeah, no, whatever. Like I'm here to serve. I'm here to be a part. And I'll do whatever helps the group the most. And so like, he's like, I don't care at all.
One of the things you mentioned was that you're not teaching for the rest of the semester. And I see that as a huge positive, but I know, and I've been in churches and such. And so just real quickly, have you ever had anybody in your church be like, well, what are we paying you for? Because they see the outside of the process. They're not seeing the inside, what you're doing. But have you ever had that, or how would you just quickly encourage someone who does run into, well, now the students are leading, what are you doing?
So at the church that I'm at now, no. I absolutely love my church. I have never been in a better church. And quite honestly, I might be a little bit biased, but there's not a better church on the planet. In saying that, I have been at churches where that could be particularly an issue. And so I'd be careful with how I word and how I kind of set up that experience. And I would definitely use words wisely, because if you say what I just said and say, I'm not teaching for the rest of the semester, they're going to be like, well, so you have to change that. verbiage a little bit to say I'm equipping students to be the ones that are taking the stand to lead. And it still sounds like you're involved. What I said is a very lazy way of saying what I did. But like, it's a really, really great thing. And I mean, youth pastors across the board, I hope would be like, well, yeah, no, that's awesome. Like, I hope to one day do that. Or I did it and it's awesome. But like, yeah, just be careful with how you word things. It's always good to prep with your pastor first. Because you being on board with your pastor and your pastor being on board with you is probably the best ammunition you'll ever have, especially against church members that don't see eye to eye. And so having a supportive pastor is hands down one of the best deals. If you don't have a supportive pastor, you really just need to articulate it clearly enough to where it won't get you in trouble. I mean, that's the best advice I can give. But and I am not in that right now. Like, I love my church.
To throw a real quick shout out for somebody to go back and listen. You talk about being on board with your pastor. Was it Luke Gajari?
Yeah, Luke Gajari. Yeah,
so
how to get on board with your pastor's vision.
Yeah, so
fantastic episode.
That'd be a really good one to go through. So I got a couple more questions at the end, but I want to go ahead and finish out our 3-step kind of deal. So we talked about seeing potential, challenging them to rise, and then the last one was encouraging them along the way. So after you already found them, after they've kind of stepped into a role, whether that's a little bit or a lot, how do you keep encouraging them, and how do you keep them focused and feeling like, one, you're not just using them. Hey, I don't have to get to preach because you're doing it. But how do you equip and encourage them as they continue to lead?
I think that's a multi-step process, and it's kind of easily funneled into one. But I would say largely it just goes back to the first two. If they are leading for you, then you need to be a constant source of encouragement, and you need to be a constant source of equipment. And so you need to be sure that all of your stuff is ready for them to succeed. You need to be sure that you invest enough time in them and give them encouragement to where they don't have that bad Wednesday, or they don't have that bad leading experience and they're like, man, I'm such a failure. Like, I hate this kind of thing like that, because everybody has bad days. And just students really, really harp on those negative sides. And so like being that constant sense of emotional positivity and support is huge, especially with this. Like, I'm just using the like student teaching as because it's the most recent example. I am actually leaving today to go to Nashville, and I have a student teaching on Wednesday without me being there. And I followed through the same steps that I did with everybody else. I followed through with the same mindset, the same focus of like, hey, 2 weeks out, I asked them to have their like topic and have a few scriptures ready. A week before, I asked to see their rough draft of their lesson. And then their rough draft, I'll like annotate and mark up and be like, hey, this is a little like, maybe you can add some more scripture here, or like these scriptures are great, but what does that mean? Like, kind of thing like that. And so like, it's still, you're equipping them to be better in their preparations, and you're equipping them with questions that'll hopefully spark more creativity when it comes to their like lesson writing. But then also like on all of the like annotations that I've done, it's like, man, this is awesome. Great job. Like, I love this point. Like, this is such a well thought out point, but hey, have you ever thought about adding this? Or so like you're adding that encouragement, you're equipping them. And this is in any mindset of leadership, whether it be worship or being like a greeter or them leading and teaching in group. We last year for our senior Sunday for our church, we had a senior get up and lead and teach the like Sunday sermon message. And man, she was sweating bullets when she said yes. But I was like, okay, so what do we do? Like, how do we work through this? And so basically what was like we did a little more extensive because it was a lot more people, and it's people that she didn't know. And that just brings a whole new level of nerves. And so like we extended a little more. She wrote her sermon and we had her come up to the church. We had her stand in the pulpit and we had her give the sermon to me and to my associate pastor. And she did that twice. And we gave edits and like gave her like speaking pointers and stuff like that. And then she did it one more time in front of us and my associate pastor and my lead pastor. And they added their pointers. And we all were like, you're doing great. This is awesome. And the whole time we're like keeping track of how long it was and everything like that. And said, all the ins and outs of speaking. And then the last time she did it before she led for Sunday, the Wednesday before Youth Sunday, our Wednesday night service was in the sanctuary, and she taught, basically her sermon was the lesson for that night. And so we had all the students sitting in the sanctuary, and we had like the worship band practice in the sanctuary too. And like she got up and actually gave the message that she was going to give on Sunday to the students. So it was gradually growing the audience size. It was continuously equipping and encouraging her to shine. But that goes in any mindset. If you go to worship leading, you want to make sure that you have all of the resources that they need available. Always make sure, depending on your setups for like audio and stuff like that, make sure you have batteries, make sure you have music, like have the sheets printed out for them, have like electronic copies that are readily accessible, so they can practice at home. Just be open to questions and everything like that. Equip them and encourage them along the way. And man, when they do great, let them know they killed it. When they have a rough one, encourage them and say, hey, it happens to all of us. And so like it's that last deal is just continuing the first two. And as they lead, you give them more opportunities to lead, and they step into bigger and bigger things. And it's a cool process when it works out.
And that was one of the things that you talked about. We talked about finding them and then challenging them, and that you mentioned at the end of that, talking about bigger and better things. Like there's more. Don't let them just stay at one if they're willing to take on another challenge to step up and do that next challenge. I thought that one of the things that out of all that, we're going to wrap up here in just a minute, but one of the things out of your whole process, because you went through the whole process with her, from meeting with her to getting rough drafts to going, is that a whole process. And whether it is a student giving a sermon, or whether it's a student leading worship, or whether it's setting up a team, I think it's important to note this is not something you're going to go tomorrow and go, hey, tomorrow we're going to have student-led youth ministry, and just do it. Like, it's a whole process. So can you talk just a little bit to the youth leaders who are like, hey, this is great, let's do it tomorrow. Like, what are some things they need to keep in mind? Even do you have a time frame, or what are some things that they need to think about before they jump in and just go to their pastor tomorrow and say, hey, I heard this podcast and Brent's a great guy and he told me I should do student-led youth ministry, and so here it is.
So, word of warning first, and this is something that honestly, why it took me 5 years before I'm seeing this come to fruition in this church. Not all churches are cookie cutter where you can throw like what worked at your last church will not work at your next church. I can almost guarantee, because that's a different group. It's a different area. It's a different everything, different church, different people. And so like doing what worked in one church and like trying to carbon copy that and move it over will not work. But that doesn't mean that you can't get both to a level where they're leading as students. And so as far as a time frame, I really can't give it to you. I would say that it's going to take at least 3 years. And that's just because you have to invest in the buy-in. You have to invest in the leaders. You have to pour into them so they'll pour into the students. You have to get your leaders and yourself to start handing off jobs. And especially if you were a solo youth pastor where you're in charge of the whole ministry, that is probably the hardest thing to do, is hand off jobs, especially when you think you can do them better. Or maybe this is just, I'm the only person in the world that has a problem with this, but it could be my Enneagram 8 going off again. But with that, like, that was a tremendous struggle for me. And it wasn't necessarily as much of a struggle of saying, hey, you do this, but it was a struggle of me not stepping in and correcting what was not being done to my level of expectation. And so you have to give grace. You have to give moments where they can moderately not do it like you want it, and still give them like encouragement and give them like the affirmation that you support what they're doing. I would say that you need to start with a few students first. I would find one or two that you can really, really pour into, and then slowly work your way out to where you can do a leadership team. But I'd say the biggest thing with leadership, and I say this with a bit of hesitancy because there's a lot of youth groups that have leadership teams, and basically the leadership team is just because you are doing, like, you're a greeter, or like you fill up the fridge, or you run the audio booth in the back. Be intentional about your leadership. Don't make leadership a social status. Don't make leadership something that is a clique to where they're better than the rest of your group. Or like, don't even speak of them as a higher level, just for the sake of like, that's going to be toxic super, super quickly. So you need to encourage them. And it goes back to one of the first things I said, that selfless notion, to where they don't care about, like, they can put themselves down and like they can focus on other people. That's a super important step in leadership. So I think that that's a tremendously important thing to grasp. And yeah, I think that those are the big deals. Like, it's not going to be an overnight thing. You have to put in blood, sweat, and sometimes tears, because yeah, it happens. I mean, there's definitely, there's nights that you'll stay up and be like, man, is this worth it? Like, I mean, like, I am pouring my heart and soul into these kids, and they can't stop talking about gossip at school or like whatever. Yeah. It's just like, is this really worth it? Am I doing what I'm supposed to do? But the moment that first student takes that step, man, like, it's one of the most rewarding feelings in the world, because you see it coming to fruition, and you see the work that you've been doing for so long start to pay off. And then eventually you can totally get to a point to where, like, you sit back and you watch the ministry run. And I don't think there's a better achievement for any youth pastor out there to have a fully autonomous group, because that means that the group does not revolve around you, and it shouldn't. It should revolve around Jesus. So, that's my goal more than anything else. I want students to see that they can do it. I want leaders to see that they don't need me. And man, I just want, like, that is my main goal, is for, like, I want to one day be able to leave the room like I'm doing on Wednesday. I won't be there. My associate's not going to be there. And we're going to have an entirely volunteer and student-led service. And like, I can't wait to hear all the positive outlook that comes from it.
Yeah. It's not the easy way out.
No.
It is way more work that you won't get credit for. So if you are somebody who wants the spotlight, it's not the way to go. Also, too, I think what you mentioned about being, several years. Like, I went through the same process at my church. I was there for 15 years, in youth ministry for 8. We got to that point, and then COVID hit, so it kind of messed all that up in a Wednesday night aspect. But we finally got to that point. But it was a time. But the benefit I saw was not that I could just step back and not do as much, but that I could step into other roles. So I started focusing on how am I equipping parents and the family? How am I pouring into other aspects of the church? I think we talked about last week. How am I being involved and supporting in other ways, and being a liaison in between the youth and the church, and integrating them into the body of the church, and finding those ways, because I wasn't having to plan games and plan a meal and speak every week and run the youth team and stuff. So But that's just my warning is it is not easier. It is harder. And people won't recognize that because sometimes they just see that you're what do you do now? You just go there and hang out with kids.
You just sit there. Like,
yeah.
What do you do?
Yeah. So, well, Brent, it's been great. I know you have a trip to go on. And so we need to let you get away and get packed and get everything taken care of. But anything that you want to add just at the end, any final thoughts on this or anything you want to share? I'll just give you the mic.
Yeah, no, I would just say like, I'm not going to really worry about plastering social media. Like you can follow me because like it's legitimately on every single episode. Go find me on Facebook if you have questions. Share this with other leaders. And seriously, guys, like if we request anything, it's request this is we don't care. We don't have a care in the world if we are not mentioned with this podcast. Our goal with this is for like help to get out to youth pastors. And that's why we focus so much on interviewing other people and it just not being a talk show between me and Russell, because we genuinely think that everybody has a voice and everybody has something that we can learn from. So part of that is getting that podcast out there. So like if you're listening to this now, please do us a huge favor and do one of the 3 following things. First off, you can share this podcast with a friend or share a podcast that meant a lot to you to a friend with someone that doesn't listen to the podcast. You can do word of mouth, which is really the same thing. But like if you have a group of youth pastors in your community and you've been listening to this, but you're not sure if they do and y'all meet regularly, hey, throw us out there and be like, hey, I was listening to this podcast the other day. It helps us out a lot. And we don't do any paid promotions or advertising or anything like that. And so our growth is 100% based off of you guys and how much you share it. And then finally, the other thing that allows us to kind of move up in rankings and everything like that is if y'all will do comments and ratings on our podcast. I think you could do it on most of the major platforms now. Or if you can't do that, leave us a rating on Facebook. It just gives us more opportunities to reach out to people. And like I said, we both love this. This has been one of the most encouraging and refreshing things I've done. And I just hope that it is like half as much of an encouragement to the people listening to this as it's been to me. And I still think that would be incredible. So we love this. We love you guys. Thank y'all for being a part of this almost a year ride, Russell. We are almost April 29th of 2021. We started this podcast with our introduction episode. And man, like we are legitimately a month and a half away from an entire year of this podcast. And I am pumped. I can't wait for season 2. I can't wait for all the guests that we have coming up. We have some awesome content coming up through the ropes. And over the next couple months, and it's going to be amazing.
So, Brent, we're kind of closing out just in person here. So, one, I do want to mention you can support us financially if you want to go on the page and buy some of the merchandise. We have some T-shirts. But Brent, there is a conversation happening next week. Do you know who we're talking to and what's going on next week?
So yeah, I'm super pumped about next week. It's honestly one that I've been looking forward to getting out for a while. I sit down with Brad Griffin. And Brad Griffin is the senior content director at Fuller Youth Institute with Fuller Youth Seminary in California. He works side by side with Kara Powell, and we talk about their new book, which is 3 big questions that'll change every teenager. We talk all about those questions, why they're significant. And then we also talk about, from a youth pastor perspective, how do we address those questions? From a parent perspective, how do you encourage those questions to be asked by the parents? And then just the ins and outs of all of that. And we talk a little bit about the state of youth ministry with COVID and everything like that. It's such an awesome conversation. And man, I can't wait for next week to let y'all hear that one.
That will be great. I've read a lot of the Fuller Youth, and I know that a lot of people have. And so it's great we had that conversation. And just a reminder, like we have a whole variety of people who come on the show. We have some of our friends in our ministry down the street. And then we've been fortunate enough to connect with some of these guys who who put out content and books and studies and things like that. So I'm looking forward to that conversation, and I hope you are as well. Thank you all so much for joining us on the Student Ministry Conversations podcast, and we will see you next time.
See you guys later.